Color interviews. The color interview aims to elicit responses that might not emerge in the course of an interview that begins with the discussion of ideas or issues. By focusing on the sensory experience of color, an interviewee enters the conversation in an expansive, shared field of experience from which personal and/or interpersonal observations can be made. Interviewees are invited to respond either by offering additional layers of information or by allowing the color, shape, placement decisions to voice their sensibility without further comment. The color interview process. Decide who will go first. Click on a box and fill with a solid color. Alternate turns. Complicate the conversations by adding more fields if necessary. For example, the interviewer, myself, might choose to go first and add a color to one of these boxes, the one on the left. It's the interviewee's turn then to select the other box, go to the color wheel, and choose a color that reflects his or her response to the color I've chosen, or to her particular sensibility, or to make some sort of statement. I'll tend to ask the interviewees questions as we go along, and they're welcome to respond or not. So I started off in America, and I moved all around America, going to different kinds of schools, and as I said to you, sort of being interested in literature and then moving entirely into visual arts. And then at one point I moved to London, and then I moved back to New York, and then I moved to Geneva, and then I moved to Brisbane, and then I moved to Melbourne. And I guess this idea of never anywhere dwelling is kind of the definition that philosopher Heidegger gives to curiosity. And this idea that you don't ever belong or dwell anywhere, but that you're constantly curious and making new engagements and configurations, and you alter yourself to go into a new space. And what does it mean to be able to do that well? Some people adapt better than others. Some people take their homes with them and make it exactly the same no matter where they go. Other people change radically, their accents change, their mannerisms change, and other people find the middle ways. And I'm not quite sure which I am, depending on how you read my accent, I guess we could tell later on. So this idea that one of the things that's come with me, or that I notice a lot, would be then how my color sensibility would have changed as I moved across to all these different places. And so New York State, for example, growing up, it'd be a very gray sky, most of the time very cloudy. You would have lots of snow, so you'd have this inversion of contrast. You'd have a bright ground and a dark blue sky. Geneva is very similar. Geneva is almost like living in a dome city. It's almost gray and rainy the whole time, so you have this incredibly muted set of colors. And I remember when I went to Brisbane for the first time, and I got off the plane, and not only was it that rush of heat, but the color was unbelievable. I remember this experience so well. These incredible, the purple trees. Are they frangipani or? No, yeah, it's frangipani that's purple. Do you remember?
Jacaranda.
Jacaranda, the jacaranda. Yeah. I always confuse those two. This unbelievable purple against this blue, and it was overwhelming. You know. So this whole thing, and you can feel almost with your body opening up from the heat, your color sensibility in your eyes and your senses opening up from this kind of unbelievable intensity of color. So some of the things that I'm attracted to, I guess, would be the way in which we swerve through and use color to swerve through our life. And I'll show you some of the kinds of color sensibilities that I have from art history, because that's one of the things that I've done. Cranach is very interesting because Renaissance painters and oil painting was made for this idea of complex color. And I don't know if any of you have oil painted before, but as soon as you add linseed oil to oil paint, it kind of dimensionalizes it a bit. It makes it viscous and it makes it slightly transparent. So what the Renaissance painters would often do is underpaint a green with a really bright red. And then you cover it over with this kind of green that has a little bit of blue in it. And the whole thing starts to vibrate, because what you're getting through it isn't just one color, but it's a complex color. And you don't read the red into it, but the richness of the red is underneath it. And it's a very complicated thing, because you can't say that it's a red-green. But the fact that the red is underneath there, pushing out a kind of a contrasting color from underneath, gives it this incredible vibrancy. And I remember seeing finally one of these in real life, and just thinking, oh my God, that's unbelievable, that color. And then they started to do this thing in the Louvre where they would paint rooms, as was the older tradition. They would start to paint the room's colors, so a very, very dark green or very, very dark purple. So can you imagine seeing this wonderful green in a room that's painted purple, and just sort of highlight and lit with the dark? It was like these jewels, and this sort of the viscous nature of color that the oil painting brought through was, enhanced amazingly. Holbein is also someone who does this kind of color. So this is all about the history of painting. And here you have basically the same portrait in two sort of color schemes. This one has always been. This is a very famous one. The color's a bit out here because of the projector, but this sort of red velvet and the green of the velvet tapestry. To see the actual painting it's such a complex color. So what interests me too is, and what I've often done with teaching color theory to students, is to see, well, let me put it this way. Painters will often look at a color and see all the other colors that it requires to paint that color. So Renaissance paintings are very complex. They have all these color formulas, and they sort of base them on 100, and then they add 10% with white. So you could have a green that was 20% blue, 30% a particular kind of green, 30% another kind of green, a little bit of purple, a little bit of orange, and the white on top of that. And that would be one kind of green, that then you would have a color underneath. So the kinds of colors that so you look at the grass on a particular day and you say, oh yeah, I know, cerulean blue and blah, blah, blah. And you can kind of, as a painter or as a designer, maybe you do Pantone, you start to say, oh yeah, it's these colors that would make that kind of color. And then you start to set them in combination with other colors. Like again, you can't really get a sense of this beautiful red squirrel next to this, the blue of that color it's just unbelievable. It's like the painting sings. And then you have after Holbein, this sort of Mannerist painting that came through with Pontormo and Bronzino, and they push this kind of color relationship even further. They take color and they don't make it naturalistic anymore. And I guess what I'm interested in figurative painting is that color actually sort of separates off, it kind of lifts out and moves across the surface. And so I mean, it's realistic in the sense that we don't disbelieve that the red of the velvet is that red. But in some ways it's almost, hyper-real. It disconnects from the objects around it. So Pontormo started to do this with light and skin color and cloth. And you can see in this one on the right, there is no kind of light that isn't the sense of color. And color starts to act as a kind of a substance almost. This is also Pontormo as well. The color's a bit bad here. It's much better here, I have to say. It's more subtle. It's more subtle than this. This starts to go much too yellow. The point being, though, that the Mannerist painters started to really push the edges of where color starts to vibrate. And as a result, you get these incredibly static and serene images that start to have this incredible life underneath them that you don't really realize because there's nothing happening in the image, but there's this incredible kind of life that's pulsating through it. Bronzino is another sort of late Mannerist painter moving into the Baroque, and both his subject matter and his color starts to get keyed up, and the flesh takes on all these kind of things. So this idea of oil painting and flesh and color as this kind of viscous, transparent substance has always interested me, and I've always responded to and been drawn towards those kind of things. So Ang is another, sort of middle 1800s painter, and again, he's someone that you can look at this and it looks real, of course, but there's a hyper-reality to the kinds of combinations of color. I guess perhaps it's easier to see in the one on the right. And then how it attaches itself to texture and how it attaches itself to a volume and that we start to read these things together, and that it's very, very difficult to take those apart. Then we move to someone like, I've always loved the color choices of Max Beckmann. Max Beckmann was a painter in the sort of early 1900s, so painted up to the 60s. And I'll just show you some of his self-portraits, because you can see from a very early one from the World War I to one that looks much more like sort of George Grosz or someone like that, to a sort of a style that's his own. And then he starts to really move the color around quite a bit. And so, you know, these kind of choices of where this would normally in a Renaissance painting be a dark color that would contrast against the shadow, he starts to key up these colors and make them these incredibly bright colors that start to play with the way that flesh color can be read on the face. And it's quite unusual, because they read naturalistic in some sense, but then they read otherworldly, and I think that that's what fascinates me quite a lot. So this idea of the mutation of sensibility goes into my own work. So I'll just show you very quickly that in the early part of my formation as a painter, I was very influenced by those kinds of painters and those kinds of paintings, and I guess one couldn't paint those themes seriously in the 1980s. So there was a kind of irony about these things. There was a kind of an acknowledgement that you were accumulating your resources and your influences, and you were playing them back through a set of combinations. And I guess that color would be a part of that. That the kind of intensity of color and the kind of choice of texture and light would be playing back through the history of art that you're trying to find your place within, that you're trying to find your place within history. So yet again, this kind of way of making an art's practice being the way in which you alter yourself through the world, the way in which you go back into time, into history, and pull back through the things that you recombine in order to set yourself into a relationship with the world, is very, very important. And I see that as, you know, one of the ways in which I probably coped through the world. With people with an iPad or with a computer, and set up a PowerPoint, and have two sides that were both color fields. And the idea was to simply decide who'll go first. You click on a box with a solid, and you take turns. And I got this idea that, in fact, because color is such an ingrained aspect in our life, that this was not only a way to gain information about one's sensibility, but it was also a way to gain information about people's orientation of going through the world. And then it would always start to go into other directions. It would always start to encapsulate other kinds of concerns and values. Because once you kind of tap into things that are very, very deep, they sort of then connect to the other things that are deeply connected to that person. So what I thought maybe we could do today, let me see if I can get out of here. Would be to do this with you. So if I were to ask you, based on the purple that's on the right, and we have a chance to change the color on the left, what color should we choose? Does anyone have a suggestion of which way we'd like to go today? How are you feeling?
Green.
Green.
Red.
Thea says green. Okay, so we have,
green.
we have a green good. Now. What green should we go? Darker, lighter, brighter, bluer?
Yellower.
Yellower. Okay, so we'll move towards yellow. Oops. No, it's not yellow enough, is it?